Many thanks, Jerry. Can I just say it's slightly disconcerting when you're about to begin the presentation that the chair praises your co-presenter but doesn't mention you at all. But I will take that in the spirit that it was meant, which was a celebration of Denise as opposed to a lack of recognition of my genius. But thank you, Jerry. But no,
everyone knows you, Joe.
But no, what we want to try and draw this together, hopefully relatively briefly, because we realise that we have some questions and answers afterwards and lunch as well to get to. And what we want to talk about is effectively the culture or the conceptual map that we came up with from the project. And we're calling it a conceptual framework, but it's some way of trying to draw together what we discussed this morning in the various different presentations, and to see how we might be able to use that to take these ideas forward. So that's effectively what our presentation is about. So it's looking at the literature surveys that we spoke about and also the questionnaires as well, and to see if we can bring these together and in some way create a baseline from which to move on from here. The paper is actually in it's both in the online program for it, and it's also on the website as well. So it might be useful if we're interested, or if you're interested in taking this a bit forward, it might be interesting for you to take a look at that, because it does act as a summary document. It does act as a summary idea for what we've done to date. And two things I'll concentrate on, and then I'll hand over to Denise. Firstly, and I think most challengingly in many ways for us as a project team, and perhaps for yourselves who are interested in the area of discussing cultural responsive assessment, is how do we define these things? And for the first extended period of our time together, we spent a long time talking about, well, look, what exactly is culture? And while we think this is something that we're pretty confident in discussing and pretty confident in engaging with, it actually is quite a complex area. And our definition of culture and our organisation around our concepts of culture are quite challenging. So ultimately the one we came to, which is the one used by the OECD, and you can see it here, it talks about unique cultural positioning, cultural affiliations. It looks at fluidity of students in the classroom. It looks at identity, and it looks at constellations of culture. So, but I think the essence of this way of looking at culture is emphasizing complexity. I think one of the challenges that we have when we approach any sort of educational research, and we approach educational research that's as in an area that's as complex as this, is to oversimplify it. I think one of the things we need to do at the beginning is accept the complexity of this area, and is acknowledge the complexity of this area. And even as you were asking questions this morning, you came up with areas that, if maybe the first question about gender, it was an area of enormous importance when we look at culture as an issue and as a concept, and yet it's not one that we had actually specifically focused on in this project. So I think that's a recognition of complexity. And also Barbara's last slides there, where she discussed intersectionality and the importance of intersectionality in this. We can't lose sight of that. So one of the first things then when we look at culture is it is complex. And it's to acknowledge complexity. And I think that's an important thing in terms of culture. And then the second thing, it almost applies as well to assessment as well. We've spent a lot of time discussing assessment, looking at different modes of assessment. The fantastic presentations earlier on from Luttrellstown, looking at assessment practice, looking at lived experiences in school, again looked at complexity in that area as well. So I think we need to recognize that with culture and assessment, we're looking at multifaceted, and we're looking at complex realities. So when you as teachers and you as educational professionals are dealing with this, I think it's important to give yourself permission to acknowledge this, which also has the obvious ongoing effect of saying that solutions will be complex and solutions will be multifaceted, and solutions, if they're available, may take many years or may take a lot of time to come to. And as we look at practical solutions to this, they're practical in a small way, they're not on a global way. And I think that refers back to Gurry's review of the literature as well, which shows you that there's both positives and negatives in this. There's multiple different perspectives on this, so we need to think about that as well. So we look at these in a complex area. So these are the themes that Denise will now talk through, which is looking at culturally responsive assessment. There's 7 themes. I won't read through them because we'll be looking at them in a little bit of detail now. But this is the core of our conceptual map, and this is the core of our conceptual idea. So I now hand over to Denise.
Thank you, Joe. Following the genius of Joe O'Hara. Well recognised. Okay, thank you, Joe. Okay, so the 7 themes we're using as kind of umbrellas for the concepts that we have put together from, as Joe said, the literature and the questionnaires mainly. So it's a bit of a mixed metaphor, but we're using the concepts as kind of the building blocks under the themes. So we're opening up those 7 themes to what the concepts are. Okay, so 16 concepts in the 7 themes. The first concept has those 4, the first theme has those 4 concepts, okay? I'm not going to dwell on each one at great length, just to cut things short a little bit. But to take the first one, the multicultural validity, the literature gives a definition for multicultural validity. As we know, with assessment, validity is a core foundational concept that always has to be considered, okay? So the definition in the literature for multicultural validity is the accuracy and trustworthiness of understanding and actions across simple, intersecting dimensions of cultural difference. So the authors of this definition tease out the definition to embrace 5 elements: the theory of assessment, the theory underlying it, especially the purpose of the assessment, the methodology, the methods, modes used for the assessment, the relationships, the experience, and the consequence. So we'll take up those areas later when we look at the criteria for culturally responsive assessment. Okay. Under the second one, assessment majority and minority cultures, we've mentioned already, some of the speakers, the differential in the performance in, for example, PISA for Indigenous students and students with a migration background. So we're not going to dwell on that. So skipping down to the language matters, as Guru mentioned, the responses to diversity in classrooms can vary, and Guru mentioned the deficit model that we've come across in the experience of the questionnaire and the case studies too, that sometimes the lack of proficiency in the language of the classroom can be regarded by teachers as a kind of a difficulty, a problem, a risk. So students who do not have the proficiency in the classroom language can be regarded as like students with special needs, okay? So it kind of otherizes the students a little bit, that kind of deficit model. And the literature says this negative response can devalue students' culture and language and, quote, can have a negative impact on their overall achievement and motivation. So the strength of their engagement in schoolwork can be diminished if they have a sense of their own language and culture is devalued. So many researchers share criticism of this negative response, the deficit one as it's called, and strongly support multilingualism in schools. A little aside on the terminology, the Council of Europe and the European Centre for Modern Languages is now preferring the term plurilingualism to multilingualism, plural, many languages. Okay, so we're tending to use that term now, plurilingualism. It's a richer and broader term than multilingualism because it means not only that a person is proficient in several languages, but that the person has the capacity to engage with people of varied languages and cultures. So it's broader, richer. It's really referring to an intercultural competence. More on that later. So publications of the Council of Europe are emphasising that the days of one language being associated very much historically with the nation state, and we did since the 19th century emphasise with the growth of the nation state, the monolingualism that got identified, a sense of identity as a nation was so important and stressed during the 19th century, that multilingualism and plurilingualism didn't have a place really. But the European perspective now is that we are past that and we are now need to engage with and respect and use many languages. So Ireland's national statements on language policy are in alignment with this perspective, the European perspective of the Council of Europe. The publications of the department in recent years are in alignment with that, and there's been several in recent years. Languages Connect is, I think, the most recent one. Many comments from school personnel in the open-ended comments of the questionnaire indicate that school personnel may not be in alignment with the principle espoused by the Council of Europe and the European Centre for Modern Languages and other authors, as the recent literature about linguistic diversity are in alignment with the Council of Europe position. Questionnaire comments indicate a tendency towards managing language diversity. How do I manage it in the classroom rather than a more positive approach? And finding it difficult rather than adopting the plurilingualism as a goal. But for school personnel, a teacher in the classroom faced with students from different countries and languages, there is a tension for the teachers. Because comments in the questionnaire reflect the onus on teachers for the high-stakes assessment in the language of the partner country, okay? So teachers see their role very much as preparing students to do well in the national standardized testing and see the plurilingualism of the classroom as something of a hindrance very often towards that. However, the research says that attention given to a student's first language facilitates the student's acquisition of a second language, depending on some contextual factors, but that's what the literature is saying. Cummins in Canada, etc., and other modern European authors, Hancock, etc., Van Athemat, are saying that it's not lost time. You're not losing time to prepare them for the junior cert or the leaving cert if you give some attention to their first language. And attention to the first language is considered in the literature to be very, very important. Now, homogeneity or diversity in the class group. Just a little bit on that. Some authors claim that teachers tend to homogenize, make all the students seem to be the same, overshadowing differences that may exist. In some ways, that's similar to what Guru was talking about with the colour blindness, kind of ignoring difference, just going on with our classroom activity as though they're all the same. Opposed to this position of school personnel is the oft-stated desirability of diversity as a benefit for all students. And we have loads of documents and loads of rhetoric about how the experience of diversity is good for all of us. Sections of the questionnaire that sought the attitudes of school personnel indicated very positive appreciation for the benefits of cultural diversity. And we have, in Ireland, we have national policy statements about the benefits of diversity for all of us. Okay. So in our second theme, the building blocks are there about fairness. I'm not going to dwell on that terribly much, except to say that there are legal obligations for us to for equality and to treat everyone with respect and to treat everyone equally and with equity, etc. But in the literature, there's far more emphasis on social justice and fairness, the equal opportunity for students with a migration background to have the opportunity to perform well academically as well as the Indigenous students. So that's been very much the impetus. We've got to be fair to all students. Okay, so the third theme, assessment and cultural dimensions. This one is fairly important, really. The background of this, Hofstede was one of the first authors back in the 1980s who started writing about cultural dimensions. He was working in an outfit, something like Google, a commercial business outfit where there were people from many different cultures working together, and observing different ways of thinking, different ways of operating and so on, led to a body of literature on this cultural dimensions. So the people built on his work very significantly since the 1980s, and one group who took up the notion of cultural differences and applied it to education, ways of thinking, ways of learning, and so on, were Parrish and Linda Van Boschot, mentioned there. Their 2010 publication is called A Framework for Cultural Difference. So they identified 8 different dimensions in 3 groups. The 3 groups, just before I go on to the 3 groups, they also give a really strong caveat. It's not either or. It's not, you're either this or you're that. If you're from that country or that culture, you're like this. If you're from that culture, and our instincts would say it's not broad like that. It's not, what's the word I'm trying to think of? It's more a spectrum. It's a continuum, okay? and we're not all on the same spectrum, but that it depends very much on how much one's enculturated in one's first culture, and how much one's adapted to another culture, and how much one has experienced different cultures, etc. So it's not an either-or condition. Spectrums along which both cultures and individuals vary. Okay, and it can depend on personality factors. I think that came up in earlier speech, etc., as well as cultural factors. How much one has been exposed to and adapts to different situations. Okay, so the three groups that Parrish and Linda van Beschot identified were social relationships. So in a teaching learning situation, that can impact on the way students interact with the teacher, the expert, or as an equal, as in a more democratic way. So that there can be a cultural dimension around that way, the way that we relate as teachers and learners. Second identified group is the epistemological beliefs, and that's the spectrum there. The continuum is a stability seeking, needing to the sort of certainty, and therefore an assessment. That's the kind of assessment that likes right answers or wrong answers. Is it right or is it wrong? And the literature had a lovely example of that, in that students who'd been asked for their response to an image, a metaphor in stanza 3 of a poem. Is this image effective? And a student's response was, how do I know if it's effective? What's the right answer? Is it effective or not? That kind of, response needing the stability. Is it right or is it wrong? Whereas other cultures are more comfortable with uncertainty and can look for the evidence. I justify that I think this image is effective because it made me think of or visualize. Okay, so there's that kind of spectrum going on, needing stability and comfortable with uncertainty. Okay, the third group, different temporal perceptions, clock time and event time. It's described as linear time and cyclical time, and that can affect the way we keep to class time, or the way we attend lectures, or the way we attend appointments with supervisors or teachers, etc. Different approaches to time. Okay. Okay, theme 4 is basically just got that one concept mentioned before, that all students benefit. This is not just about migrant students. All students benefit from culturally responsive assessment. And there's a fair bit in the literature about that. So researchers who support plurilingualism, and in the last 10, 15 years there's quite a number, plurilingualism in classrooms, maintain that all students benefit with an increase in language awareness, okay? And meta-language awareness is what they also call it. If you become familiar with how different languages operate, even if it doesn't mean you become to be fluent in 5 different languages that may be in the classroom, but that you get a meta language awareness. You become aware of well, this is how the German language operates, so this is how the Austrian, the Turkish language operates, etc. You get a meta language awareness, is what the literature says. It also says that plurilingualism in the classroom helps the well-being, the self-efficacy, and the motivation, the learner autonomy of all students. And some researchers in the Netherlands report that students who conducted tasks in a physics class, in different languages, drawing on the language of the students in that group, and I think there was Syrian and Dutch and 2 or 3 other languages in the one classroom, drawing on the first language of all the classes in that physics group, quote, appeared to strengthen the concepts the pupils gained. So the concept in physics that the lesson was focused on, by drawing on the language of all the first language of all the students in the group, helped all the students in the class to strengthen the concept. Okay, so they're saying that's a very strong aspect about plurilingualism in the classroom. It helps all the students understand. Okay. Theme 5, the possibility, and there's 2 aspects to this possibility. The criteria that we put together for culturally responsive assessment is really a synthesis of different things we found in the literature. The Code of Fair Testing practice from the States, the multicultural validity definition referred to earlier, and the Parish and Indervan Burshot framework for cultural dimensions. When we integrated those three, we put together 8 criteria for the preparation of assessment tasks, the execution, the carrying out of the assessment, and the outcomes of assessment. So we've put those 8 together, and they'll be explored this afternoon in the workshop. Okay, we don't have time to look at those now. The second part of this possibility, sorry, I must have skipped one there. There's another one too, theme 5. I seem to have lost it. Okay, so the second part of theme 5 is, in the literature, it does explore different modes that have the potential to be culturally fair. And the first one of those is performance-based assessment. And the definitions for performance-based assessment is that it's not like traditional assessment in the sense that it's not memory recall. It's about applying knowledge or skill. It's about demonstrating knowledge or skill. You might have to play an instrument, or you may have to construct an argument, or give a debate, or give an oral presentation or something. You actually have to, or solve a problem. You have to demonstrate your skill or knowledge in some way, okay? So performance-based assessment is put forward as potential to be culturally fair, but also the literature says there are issues around performance-based assessment, issues of validity and reliability, and they take longer to prepare, to plan, they take more resources. So we can recognise that performance-based assessments can be difficult, but still worth pursuing. Okay, the second type of assessment that is put forward by the literature is peer and self-assessment. The potential for that to be culturally fair, for peers to be assessing, and there's quite a bit in the literature of ways of doing that in our recent literature. Okay. And the third type that is put forward by the literature is creativity assessment. And creativity is not just the obvious ones of, writing a poem or writing an essay or something. It can be using creativity to solve a problem, or constructing an argument, etc. There's lots of ways in which we do use creativity. So the literature is saying creativity assessment also has great potential to be culturally fair. The questionnaires that came back from our secondary schools indicated online assessment strategies that some teachers are using for students from a migration background, as in particular the cognitive ability tests, and there's a platform called Kahoot. It's on lots of 180 countries are using Kahoot apparently, so it's well known. Think, Pair, Share, and tests of numerical ability. So they're ones that some of the teachers mentioned in our case studies. Okay. Theme 6. So this is a conceptual and a methodological challenge for teachers, and a significant challenge. So the context for the challenge can be drawn from both an historical political perspective and a professional perspective. I mentioned earlier the growth of the nation state with the really strong emphasis on monolingualism of the 19th, early 20th century, etc. And now we're kind of moving to a different place. But the other aspect to this is, for the challenge for teachers, is that teachers have always been reflective practitioners. If you're old enough to remember Schoen's book from, I think, 1983, The Reflective Practitioner, and it was republished, I think, last year, the year before. It's quite an iconic book, yeah. Okay, so drawing on that notion of the reflective practitioner and some of the more recent books that came out, that it is the practice of teachers to reflect on their practice. Teacher engagement in reflection on practice leads teachers to question, quote, our own attitudes, thought processes, values, assumptions, prejudices, and habitual actions to try to understand our complex roles in relation to others. So teachers are really, for the main, very good at reflecting on their practice and including their beliefs about learning, beliefs about students, etc. Okay. The American Evaluation Association published a statement on cultural competence, which was described as, quote, a stance taken towards culture, not a discrete status or simple mastery of particular knowledge and skills. It doesn't mean, I should go and find out what's the population of all these different countries, and I should find out what the cuisine is and what the flags are and what the festive days are. It's not about gathering a lot of facts about different cultures. That's not what a cultural stance is. The statement adds, cultural competence is not a state at which one arrives, rather it's a process of learning, unlearning, and relearning. This is a daunting task, being a culturally competent teacher in a diverse classroom. Thank you. Okay. We don't want to miss lunch. Okay. And a professional teacher is being called to reflect on practice in a very deep manner. There are several different templates in the literature for this kind of reflection for teachers. Okay, jumping down. As well as being reflectors on their own practice and their own enculturation, the literature also calls for teachers to be researchers of their own students. And this afternoon in the workshop, they will give an example of the kinds of questions for asking all students. We don't ask students just because of how they're dressed or what colour they are or what their hair is like or anything. It's for all students. And an example of one of those 20 questions is, what languages do you speak? What languages do you write? What language do you think in? Those kinds of questions that are relevant to the learning process and the assessment process, okay? So in the context of huge demands on teachers, and that was very strong in the questionnaire, the demand for teachers to give more and more attention to the individual needs of individual students, as we know in the last 20 years, that's intensified greatly. So the school day, the classroom time is intensely concentrated, busy time. There's huge demands on teachers, huge demands that have increased tremendously in the last how many years, and huge demands for change, etc. Okay, nearly there. Okay, so the supports teachers need, really important. The depth of the challenge for teachers. Requires theoretical and practical supports. The questionnaire indicated some of the supports that teachers need, range from a need from state-level recognition of the needs, policy formulations at national and local levels, professional development, resources for classroom assessment, developed centrally and available online, language support. So all levels of leadership in the education system need to appreciate the vision for the culturally competent teacher in a plurilingualistic classroom, so that policy, resourcing and practice at all levels will support teachers to meet the daunting challenge. And I won't go through all the details of the vision. I'll come to the conclusion. The literature is drawn from many different countries, implying that the issue of culturally responsive assessment is relevant in many countries. These 16 concepts are offered as just central considerations wherever the issue of culturally responsive classroom assessment at secondary level is of concern. In a sentence, we are very aware that the reality of classroom assessment can be quite different from the vision that's currently there in the literature. And who started this morning? It was Brian, our president, wasn't it? That quoting Seamus Heaney, that you have to have the words before you can implement. So we're getting the words. We seem to be at that stage at least. And so I'd just like to mention that the toolkit and the module this afternoon are small steps, just tin openers, to, again, mix the metaphor, small steps and tin openers, really, in implementing the theory that we've heard from all our speakers this morning. Finally, I'd like to add my thanks to Fionnuala and Kira from Notchelstown Community College, because it was one of the schools in our case studies, and in that presentation we heard some of the great things going on in the school, and some of the strategies that we have in the toolkit came from the teachers in Notchelstown Community College and from Mary Kenny, their development officer from the Dublin Dunleary ETB. And the work that's going on there in the ETB network is just really fabulous work that's being done. The professional development for teachers there is just outstanding. So thank you very much. Very grateful for your support. Okay. Gurmila Margot Galère. Thank you.
Louise and Joe. So we have a few minutes for questions. I think we'll take questions, not just to the final group, but any questions that are outstanding that people want to ask any of our previous presenters. Yes?
Thanks for the presentation this morning. I thought you were very interesting. Recently, I was in attendance at a teacher recruitment forum held by the Department of Education, a lot of consultation, and it seems like you're at the forefront of trying to deal with an issue that perhaps the education system is trying to address, in that if you take our teaching profession, particularly here in Ireland, it's Irish, it's Catholic, it's white. They talk in the Department of Education discussions about the middle classisation of the profession. So it just strikes me, of all of the work you've put in terms of putting it to an implementation phase, and I've been looking through your material online about supporting teacher development in this area. A general question, would it help if we had a more diverse teaching profession to try and implement some of these changes? Thank you.
Well, I'd be happy to say a very brief word on that. The answer is yes, it would dramatically, I think, make a very significant difference. It's striking that when you go to a lot of schools now, the variety of students that are there is not mirrored at all by the variety in the teaching force. How to get around that is very, very difficult. We certainly haven't moved in the right direction, in my humble opinion, in recent years. A lot of what the Teaching Council has done, in my view, has made it even more difficult for people to get into teaching if they don't come from the traditional middle class. It's very expensive, apart from anything else now, to qualify as a teacher. It takes as long as a doctor, or longer. So I think that's a really important point. There have been a few scratches at the surface in that, in attempting to provide scholarships for people of colour, for example, to come into teacher education, but it's a very small number, and it's recognised internationally, particularly in the literature in the United States in this area, that it's an absolutely vital component of meeting the needs of a changing school population to try and have it a more diverse teaching force. Yes.
There's two projects going on at the moment, one in Reno and one in Maynooth, that you're possibly aware of what they're doing there to try to address exactly what you're referring to here.